So Corby prayed before the service as we all gathered around. He said, I pray that Brian would not be rusty. So, you can vote on that in about 40 minutes. We'll see. I do want to say thank you. Thanks for praying for our family through the summer. It was definitely that's why I think that song just gripped me. It was definitely a challenging summer losing my mom, and I appreciate you guys all praying for us. It feels strangely moving just to be back with you and in the Word. So Genesis 39, if you've got a Bible with you, we're going to be looking this morning at the life of Joseph, who's one of the greatest characters in the Bible. And as I was sitting with the Joseph story and reading it over and over, the thing that struck me about Joseph's life was that Joseph didn't know that he was going to become a great man. Right? So when we first encounter Joseph, he's 17 years old, and he's really just getting crushed by life and the circumstances of life. He's got these wild swings of highs and lows, and he has no idea what God's going to do in his life. He certainly doesn't know that he's going to end up in this thing that we call the Bible, and that hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people would read his story, be inspired by his story. He's just trying to survive these circumstances and walk faithfully with the Lord, and he does. He becomes this man of integrity, and in the process of becoming this man of integrity, God makes him into a person who brings deliverance. Right? He brings deliverance to the entire nation of Egypt, to the surrounding nations, to his family. So millions of people survive and don't starve to death because Joseph becomes a man of integrity and faithfulness through all of these circumstances that God puts him through. And in a sense, he really becomes a picture or type of Jesus as well, who was faithful to his father and then became a deliverer for us, and also a picture of what we're called to be. Right? God calls us to enter into this process of what God is doing through Jesus to deliver people and to rescue people. And so I think there's just so many wonderful lessons to learn from Joseph's life. We're going to begin this morning in chapter 39 and verse 1. If you would read that with me. Chapter 39 of Genesis and verse 1. It says, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there." Now, a little bit of background. Joseph is in Egypt because his family is a train wreck. If you were here a couple weeks ago, Zach talked a little bit about Jacob's family, and he said, Jacob's family was an absolute mess. This is a 4,000-year-old illustration of a dysfunctional family, right? That you've got these sons, 12 sons of Jacob, and they hate each other. They're envious. They're jealous of one another. They are not men of character. They are men who pursue their passions and yield to their passions. And their father, Jacob, knows these things. He sees these things, and he doesn't intervene. He doesn't train his sons to become men who follow the Lord with all of their heart, soul, mind, and strength. He lets them, in a sense, kind of run wild. And so his family is highly dysfunctional. And he adds to that dysfunction by showing favoritism, creating even more division among his kids. He favors Joseph above all of his other kids. There's a story about this. Turn back just a couple chapters. Chapter 37, verse 1. Gives us a little more background. It says, "Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned in the land of Canaan. And these are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father." So here's the favored son, and he's tattling on his brothers and bringing back a bad report. That doesn't help matters at all. And then it says, "Now Israel," or Jacob, "loved Joseph more than all of his sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him, and only him, this beautiful, valuable tunic that made him stand out as the favored son above all." His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, and so they hated him. And they could not even speak to him on friendly terms. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." Then his brothers said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us?" And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So they hated Joseph. They hated him even more. They hated him even more than that. You might say, "Joseph, you're kind of an idiot. I mean, you got a dream, great, just keep it to yourself," right? Instead, he goes, "Hey, come on, listen to my dream. I had this great dream. I have a sheaf, my sheaf stands up, and all your sheaves, which represent you, you bow down to me." What do you think that means? I mean, okay, so he's naive, has another dream, the sun and moon and stars all come, and they bow down to him, tells that dream to his dad and his mom. His dad says, so we're all gonna bow down, mom and I are gonna bow down to you as well, and your brothers. And I mean, so certainly it's naive, and you can see that, and the result is that they hated him, they hated him, they hated him, they hated him. So they had an opportunity. Later on, they were out in the fields and they were pasturing flocks, and Jacob sends Joseph, and he says, "Why don't you check on your brothers?" Because maybe he's expecting again to get a bad report. They're not doing what they should be doing. So he sends Joseph. Joseph finds his brothers. They see him coming from a long way off, and they say, "We've got a solution. Let's just kill him." That's who these men are. That's what has happened to this family. And remember, God chose Abraham and built a family for Abraham so that Abraham's family would become a blessing. But they weren't a blessing. In fact, at one point, Jacob said to his sons, "You've actually made me odious to the people of the land." This is who these men are. They say, "You know what, here's the solution to this problem that we have, this brother of ours, let's just kill him." And Reuben, who was the oldest, who was not necessarily always a good man. Remember, he had slept with his father's concubine. His father knew about it and didn't do anything, again, very passive. But Reuben says, "Oh man, that's a bad idea. Here, you know what, let's just throw him in a pit. We could sell him as a slave." Because Reuben's thinking, "I'll just go back to the pit later, I'll rescue him and restore him." And they go, "Yeah, that's a great idea. Why kill him when we can make some money off of him?" So they agree. They throw him in the pit, and apparently Reuben had to leave. He checks on some sheep. When he comes back, Joseph's gone. The brothers had pulled him out of the pit. There was some Ishmaelites coming by. They said, "We have a slave for sale." And all this time, remember, Joseph is in the bottom of the pit, and he's crying, and he's yelling, and he's saying, "Please, please, you're my brothers, rescue me." And they sit around the pit, and they just have a meal. And they ignore all of his cries. They take his coat, they tear it up, they kill an animal, they put blood on it. Think about the cruelty to Joseph, but then the cruelty to Jacob. They take it back to Jacob. They say, "Is this the coat that you gave to your son?" And Jacob, he weeps and he mourns and he tears his own clothes. And they never tell. It's a conspiracy and they never break, but they carry that guilt their whole lives. So why is Joseph down in Egypt? Because his family is an absolute mess. Also, because God is sovereign. Okay, and that's really that's where the arc of the story gets to eventually, is that God is sovereign and God is going to use him to deliver his family and the Egyptians and all the surrounding nations God's going to use. But at this point in time, Joseph doesn't know any of that. And it seems that God has abandoned him, and yet he still chooses to remain loyal and faithful and to maintain his integrity. And as I was meditating on this passage and praying, saying, "Lord, what are you teaching me?" It just struck me so profoundly that some of you also may be going through these circumstances, and God, he sees you. He has not abandoned you. You may not see him in the moment, but he's still there, and he's doing something, and he's wanting to shape you, and he's wanting to shape me. And we don't see where this story is going, but there's something beautiful that he's wanting to do through this story, which is your life. even when you can't see it. But what you have to do is you have to remain faithful through that process. So in the fall, we are going to study the book of 1 Peter. So I've been reading ahead a lot on 1 Peter and meditating on 1 Peter. I'm going to give you a little preview from chapter 1. We'll unpack this a lot more in a few weeks. But it goes like this. In this you greatly rejoice, that is, in your salvation, which will be revealed fully to you at some point in time. He says, in this salvation you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, just notice that little phrase right there in the middle, if necessary. For us to become the kind of people with character that doesn't wither, we have to be tested. We have to be stretched. We have to be tried. Because it's in that stress, that stretching and stressing, that we become dependent upon God and His Spirit, and He molds us into the very image of Christ. Remember a couple of years ago we studied James chapter 1. Consider it all joy, reckon it joy, count it as joy when you are going through various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result so that you may be perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. You do not get to the point of maturity apart from being tested and tried. It just doesn't happen. But when you're in the middle of it, you're wondering, God, are you there? God, do you see me? And the answer is absolutely yes. He is with you, and He's shaping you to become a person who participates with Him in this rescue mission, this deliverance mission. Remember, church, God didn't rescue us from the penalty of our sin just to get us to heaven, but to transform us and make us like Jesus and to enter into this rescue process with Him. But to do that, we've got to learn to walk faithfully in the midst of temptation. Now, in Joseph's life, there are three enormous areas of temptation that he's got to overcome. I would say the same apply to us. The temptation to give in to the lusts of his flesh, the temptation to give up when the trials just come one after another, and then finally the temptation to get even when he has power. Now this morning we're only going to deal with the first one. We'll try to get back to maybe Numbers 2 and 3 in a couple weeks. But I want us to look specifically at this one. How do we overcome the temptation to give in to the lusts of our flesh, the passions of our flesh, so that we can become the kind of people that God uses to rescue and to deliver others? So I want you to keep reading with me. Chapter 39, if you go back there, chapter 39 and verse 2. The story goes on like this. Now the Lord was with Joseph. So he's now a slave, but it says the Lord was with Joseph. So he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. It came about from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything that he owned in Joseph's charge. And with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Now, before we look at how Joseph responded to temptation, I want you to notice that Joseph wasn't tempted because he was living in sin or walking in disobedience, right? It wasn't, and maybe you feel that sometimes, all of a sudden the temptation comes upon you. And is it because I'm sinning? No, he's walking in obedience. He's walking in faithfulness, and it's in that place that the temptation hammers him. And I would argue that's actually part of what gives him his greatest strength, is because he's busy obeying. He's busy walking in integrity. He's busy doing his duty that God has called him to, and that gives him, in a sense, a measure of protection from the temptation. Think about the story of David and Bathsheba. It's a little preface to that story before he sins. It says, during this time when kings go out to war with their armies, David's in Jerusalem with nothing to do. Right? And that's when he falls into temptation. But Joseph is busy being faithful. But his faithfulness doesn't, in a sense, protect him from the attack coming, but I would argue that the faithfulness gives him a strength as he's going through the attack. So he's serving his master as a slave in excellence. He's not wallowing in self-pity. He's living with faithfulness. And the result is blessing. Verse 2, notice it says, the Lord was with Joseph. He wasn't alone. The Lord was with him. He was not bound to Canaan or bound to the geography of Israel. He's with him in Egypt. And so he became a successful man. So he's a slave, but he's a success. He's known for his excellence and for his skill. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So he's not out in the field. He's not actually even living in the slaves' quarters. He's moved into the house because he's so successful. And he's bringing blessing. Verse 3, now his master saw that the Lord was with him and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. How did the Egyptian captain of the bodyguard know that it was Yahweh, the covenant-keeping name of the Lord? Because Joseph told him, yes, you're being blessed. You know why you're being blessed? It's not me. It's the Lord through me, which you see this pattern in Joseph's life throughout his entire life. When he's interpreting dreams, it's the Lord who interprets dreams. It's the Lord who brings blessing. It's Yahweh. And if you think about it, there was only one other worshiper of Yahweh who'd ever been in Egypt, and that was Abraham for a brief period of time. Now there's one worshiper of Yahweh, and he says, it's the Lord. And his master has to acknowledge it's the Lord that's bringing the blessing. Verse 5, it came about from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, that the Lord, Yahweh, blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus, the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. That is absolutely everything. And that's why God chose Abraham and blessed Abraham so that Abraham could be a blessing. But the family was not a blessing. So God plucked Joseph out and he made him a blessing. And he made him a model, a prototype of what the family should be. And eventually he would rescue again, not only Egypt and the surrounding nations from starvation, but he would rescue his own family spiritually. And he would help them become who God had called them to be. Verse 6. So he left everything that he owned in Joseph's charge with him. There he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Now, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now that turned out to be the blessing that was a curse a bit, right? And I read that verse this week and I thought, man, don't I know it? Just kidding. Sometimes I have to remind Tristy of that. You are so blessed. Sorry. Those random thoughts also come in the midst of, hopefully some deeper meditations. Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. What's actually interesting about that phrase is it's only used of one other person in the entire Bible, Joseph's mom. So, man, he was a really attractive young man, and that made him vulnerable to a particular form of temptation. Verse 7 came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said to him, lie with me. But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household were there inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled, and he went outside. So here, the particular temptation is sexual, but you could apply it to any passion of the flesh. I want to read you a quote from a short work by Dietrich Bonhoeffer entitled Temptation. He wrote, in our members there is a slumbering inclination towards desire, which is both sudden and fierce. With irresistible power, desire seizes mastery over the flesh. All at once, a secret smoldering fire is kindled. The flesh burns and is in flames. It makes no difference whether it is sexual desire or ambition or vanity or desire for revenge or love of fame and power or greed or money. What happens is that joy in God is in course of being extinguished in us, and we seek all our joy in the creature. At this moment, God is quite unreal to us. He loses all reality, and our only desire is for the creature. The only reality is the devil. Satan does not here fill us with hatred of God, but with forgetfulness of God. The lust thus aroused envelops the mind and will of man in deepest darkness. The powers of clear discrimination of decision are taken from us. It is here that everything within me rises up against the word of God. So you see what he's saying? He's saying it doesn't matter if it's sexual or it's vanity or I want revenge. It's just, these are the passions of the flesh. And the moment that I entertain it, man, it rises up like a flame. It just goes, whoo. And in that moment, it's not that I hate God, it's that I forget God. So if you entertain it, you're making yourself vulnerable in that very moment. For Joseph, it happened to be a sexual temptation, but I want you to imagine for a moment yourself, what are those passions of the flesh, whether it's money or fame or possessions or revenge, again, anger and hatred, or maybe it is sexual. Imagine for a moment, what is it for you that rises up in that moment and can envelop you in flame and cause you not to hate God and to hate his word, but to forget it. Because this applies to all of us, and every single one of us have experienced these passions of the flesh. Because as we think about how we apply this in particular, may not be sexual sin, but it might be a different kind of sin. Here it is sexual. This is how Joseph is attacked. And maybe it's where, in a sense, he has a vulnerability because he's such a handsome young man. But put yourself into the story. I would argue that in our current culture, certainly we're an aggressively sexualized culture. The temptation races after us now in a way that I think is really illustrated well in this story. Notice what the story says here in verse 7. It says, it came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, lie with me. In Hebrew, that's two words. She says, essentially, she goes, sex now. Or she's very, very aggressive, and she's persistent. It says day after day after day after day after day. Can you imagine this handsome young man every single day his master's wife says, lie with me, lie with me, lie with me, lie with me, lie with me. Verse 12 says, then when the men of the household were outside, she caught him by his garment, saying again, lie with me. And in biblical literature, and I would say in the culture that we watch, we normally think of the man as the aggressor, but this woman is aggressively coming at him and saying, lie with me. But again, the principle applies to all of the passions of the flesh. Where does your flesh go? So, the acronym HALT, you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired. What rises up within you? And how do you say no to your flesh so that you can say yes to obedience? 1 Corinthians 9. Paul wrote, I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and I make it my slave. Some translations say I buffet my body. The image is of a person's eye being blackened. Boom. This is what I do to my body. I buffet. It's very aggressive language. Paul says, I'm buffeting my body. I'm making my body my slave. Why? Because if I'm a slave to my body, I can't be a blessing to others. But if I make my body my slave, then my body, my mind, my spirit, my heart, my emotions, my will can be a blessing to others. And that's why God has blessed you and me, so that we can be a blessing to others. That's why we have to master the flesh and not be mastered by our flesh and our passions. So how do we do that? I'm going to give you 4 observations from this passage that I think help us overcome the temptation of the flesh. First is this: reject all excuses. One of the things you don't see in this text is Joseph making any excuses and even opening the door a crack, and he could have. I was thinking, if I were Joseph, what would the excuses be that I would make? I might say, I have a right to be angry because it appears that God has abandoned me, my family has abandoned me. I have the right to be angry. I have the right to be resentful. I have the right to be bitter. Why not? Since I've been betrayed and forsaken. I might have said, no one will know. It appears not only is God not around, but there's nobody in the house. No one will know. Everyone is doing it, right? He might not have put it in that language. We put it in that language in our culture. But in the slave culture in Egypt, promiscuity was rampant. It's well documented. So slaves were unfaithful. I don't have a choice. It's my master's wife. She's telling me to do this thing. But Joseph doesn't make any excuses for sin. He doesn't open the door for sin. Second, rehearse God's blessings. Can you guys forward that? Thank you. Rehearse God's blessings. Look to me again in verse 8. He says, it says, he refused and he said to his master's wife, behold with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. He has put all things that he owns in my charge. So Joseph is, he's a slave, but he's also blessed. Right, again, he's not working the fields. He's not living with the servants. He's actually living in the house. He's doing really well. He's successful. He's being acknowledged for his excellence. And he's aware of that, and he recounts that, and his master trusts him profoundly. So he's aware of the blessings. Verse 9, at the end, he says, how could I do this great evil and sin against God? In light of all of the ways that God has blessed me and blessed my master through me, it just doesn't feel at all appropriate, in a sense, to sin because I have been so blessed. It's a good little book if you want to dig in deeper to Joseph's life by R.T. Kendall. The title is God Meant It for Good. And he wrote this. He said, nobody is exempt from temptation, but if we do not have a love for God that is greater than the intensity of that temptation, we will give in. Did you get that? If we do not have a love for God that is greater than the intensity of that temptation, we will give in. But if we have a love for God that is greater, and Joseph acknowledges, says, how could I do this evil against God? I love God more than I lust for what the temptation is offering. And the way that we cultivate, in a sense, that love for God that gives us the power to say no to temptation is, I would argue, through gratitude. It's through literally rehearsing all of the blessings that we have from the Lord, right? Over and over and over again. Maybe it's in a journal. Maybe it's out loud. Maybe you sit with your spouse weekly and you recite these things. Let's remember, let's recite, let's call to mind. Psalmist talks about that. He says, let's walk along the ramparts and stop at all the towers, and let's remember and recite all of God's blessings that he has given to us individually, as a family, corporately, as a church, as a community, as a nation. Remember the blessings. For me, I would say the two greatest spiritual disciplines that have really been transformative for me are scripture memory and gratitude. And I can tell when my spiritual life is off a bit, it's because I'm not consistently memorizing the word, and I'm not stopping and just literally giving thanks. And so when I feel that, when I sense that, I literally stop and I give thanks. If we go all the way back to the garden, what happened with Eve is that she didn't have her no ready, and she didn't give thanks. So the serpent comes and says, man, he's stingy. He's withholding things from you. And in that moment, she could have said no. In fact, he's given us this entire garden. He's only said no to one small tree. We have thousands of trees to eat from. But she didn't have her no ready because she didn't have her recitation of all the things she was grateful for. They weren't there. And so in that moment, man, she opens the door. She has a discussion with the devil, and she gets crushed. Or think about Romans chapter 1, where Paul describes this kind of downward spiral of sin. It says, the spiral starts with this: they didn't acknowledge God as God or Remember what it says? Give thanks. So simple. If we look at Eve's illustration again, honoring God as God means God gets to be God. And Satan came and said, you don't have to let God be God. You can be your own God, right? So it's just God's God. God's great. We're creatures made in his image. We're finite. He's infinite. God is great. Let God be God. Second, give thanks. Right? Gratitude. Rehearse God's blessings. Third, reflect on the cost. Let's read again verse 8. It says, he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all things that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? But what happens when we give into our flesh is that we break trust with the people around us. And he says, I can't break trust with my master. My master has trusted me. My master doesn't mind just leaving me here alone with all that he owns, leaving me here alone even with you. He trusts me. But when we give into our flesh, we violate that trust, and it damages our relationships with one another. It also breaks the heart of God. This is a key verse in this whole narrative when he says, at the end of verse 9, how then could I do this great evil and sin against God? Will God forgive me? Yes, he's paid for my sin in Christ, but really? In friendship, we don't want to harm one another. We want to do right by one another. We don't want to presume upon God's grace. Is he gracious? Yes. Has he paid the penalty in Christ? Yeah, but if we love God, we want to obey what he says, because what he says to us is actually for our good. Third, giving into my flesh breaks down my will. That is, each time I open the door a crack and I say yes a little bit to my flesh, it becomes easier to say yes the next time. And then the next time is easier, and the next time is easier, and the next time is easier. I read a book a few years ago. It's not a Christian book, not written by Christians, necessarily for Christians, called The Willpower Instinct. I thought this was nevertheless very, very insightful. The author said, some neuroscientists go so far as to say that we have one brain but two minds, or even two people living inside our mind. There's the version of us that acts on impulse and seeks immediate gratification, and the version of us that controls our impulses and delays gratification to protect our long-term goals. What does that sound like? That's Romans 7. Right? Paul wrote about this a long time before. One brain, one organ, but there's two minds. Two people living inside our mind, and one is just saying, act, act, act. Paul says that's the flesh. But then there's another that says delay, because there is perfect gratification in the presence of God forever. And that's the Spirit speaking to us. When we say yes to the flesh, it makes it easier the next time to say yes to the flesh. And then I would say, finally, that giving into my flesh destroys my ability to be a blessing. So if I'm saying yes to my flesh, yes to temptation constantly, then I'm actually thinking about myself. I'm not thinking about others. And I'm not focused on what God has called me to be, and that is to be a blessing to others. Now, fourth, remove yourself from the source. Verse 10. As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her, or notice this, or even to be with her. So what did he do? He said, man, he's staying out of the house. He's going in the house when she's not in the house. When she's off here, he's going to a different part of the house. Like he's just saying, let me just avoid the source of temptation. Let me put up a barrier. Right, Paul talks about this, Romans chapter 13. I don't know what. Go away for a few weeks and, man, everything breaks down. All right, we're back on. But put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regards to its lust. That's what he does. It says he did not listen to her, to lie beside her. He did not even want to be with her. Joseph couldn't quit his job and get another slave job, right? He's a slave. He doesn't have that opportunity. So what he does is the best that he can in this environment to avoid temptation. So if you're an alcoholic, you don't get a job tending bar, right? Easy, right? Or whatever it is that is your particular vulnerability, you create some distance. I remember several years ago, I got a phone call from a friend of mine. It was like 10:30 at night, just kind of out of the blue. I'm thinking, oh man, I better pick this up. I picked it up and said, hey, can I come over to the house? Sure, come on over. It's a really unusual request, 10:30 at night. So he drove over, we sat down in the living room, and he said, I'm having an affair on my wife. I got caught. I said, all right, well, what do you want to do about this? Where are you going to go with this? He said, well, I'm breaking it off, whatever. I said, well, tell me about the situation. Well, it's this lady at work. I said, is she still at work? He said, yeah, she's still at work. I said, okay. And he was in this pretty prestigious career, and he was doing really well, and he liked his job. And I said, well, you might need to quit your job. In fact, you're probably going to have to quit your job. And if you want to keep your marriage, and your wife's ever going to be able to trust you again and feel safe, you're going to have to quit your job. I think you need to quit your job. How do you feel about that? He didn't say anything for a few minutes. I said, it really bothers me that you hesitated. Because if you love the Lord more than you love anything, and then you love your spouse, it's just a job, right? It's just a job. It's not your life. This is your life. This is not your life. It's just a job. I said, you might need to change careers, but you need to get away. How are you going to be able to restore trust with your spouse? Do you really want it that bad? How bad do you want holiness? How bad do you want to be like Jesus? If you really love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you'll do all that you can to create this environment in which you actually are guarded and protected from temptation. Be radical. Genuinely radical in your obedience so that you can become holy, so that you can be a blessing to others. Now, Joseph couldn't quit. He tries to create a barrier, and then what happens is sin chases him down, right? Temptation chases him down. This woman chases him down, and that's true for us as well. Sometimes we try to create wisdom and get rid of your computer. There's only a desktop computer sitting in the living room because stuff online is a temptation for you. Try to create these barriers, but man, in this culture, I would say lusts of the flesh are just chasing after us constantly. Right? Even if we create a barrier, and that's what happens, and she comes aggressively at him. So what does he do? Verse 12, it says, she caught him by his garment saying, lie with me, and he left his garment in her hand, and he fled, and he went outside. He goes, oh, I'm out, man. He runs. Does that sound familiar? 1 Corinthians 6:18, Paul says, flee sexual immorality. This is where Eve went wrong, is she had this conversation with a serpent. There's no room for that. He's smarter than we are. He's more clever in his arguments. You don't stop and stand and argue. You got your no ready, your list of gratitude, and you run. You run. I remember hearing a guy say one time, God is looking for a few good cowards. You know when to run. You know the vulnerabilities of your flesh, and you run. Verse 13 says, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said, see, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. Who's the he? That's her husband. So she brings in the other servants and throws her husband under the bus. That's not a nice lady, okay? See, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us, and he came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside. So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, the Hebrew slave whom you brought to us, sounds a little like Adam with the Lord, the wife that you gave to me, right? Oh, man. The Hebrew slave whom you brought into us came into me to make sport of me, and I raised my voice and screamed. He left his garment beside me and fled outside. Now, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, this is what your slave did to me, his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. Now, I have an observation, and I think I'm right on this. It just says here, when his master heard these words, that his anger burned. Who was he mad at? Doesn't say, okay, but here's my theory, here's my interpretation. I think he's actually angry at his wife and angry at the situation, not just angry at Joseph, because for a slave to attempt to rape the wife of the captain of the bodyguard, that's punishable by death. And Joseph doesn't go to trial, he's executed on the spot. That's normal in Egypt. He gets put in prison because what's happening here, I mean, if he's been married to this woman for a while and she speaks down about him to the other slaves, she speaks down to him here. Has this happened before? I don't know, but he knows who she is, and now Joseph, who's blessed his household and made him extremely prosperous, he's losing this excellent servant better than he's ever had. I think that actually what he's really angry at, he's angry at his wife, he's angry at the situation, he's angry at the loss of blessing, he's angry. And so as a concession, he has to do something. He has to respond to her accusation. He puts Joseph in prison. He doesn't have Joseph executed. But where is Joseph now? In prison, right? So Joseph is born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's got a nice garment. His hands are probably soft. He's usually at home hanging out with mom and dad. His life is really, really easy. And then he's in a pit, and then he's sold as a slave. But then he rises, and he's really successful. But then a false accusation, not even a true accusation, a false accusation puts him back in prison, right? And we know the end of this story, that God uses him in incredible ways, but Joseph doesn't know that. So how is Joseph going to respond now in this moment where circumstances are out of his control and they're up and down and they're high and they're low? Verse 21, it says, but the Lord was with Joseph. That's how it started when he was purchased as a slave. The Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. And Joseph now in jail, blessed by the presence of the Lord, walks in the integrity of his heart, and he is a blessing to the jailer and to the other prisoners, and life gets better. But he's still in jail. And he could be tempted to be angry, to become bitter, to try to think about how he could take revenge, to say, I don't need to walk faithfully with the Lord because he hasn't been faithful to me. But instead, he chooses in that moment to remain faithful. So how do we apply this? Again, 4 lessons. If you're going to overcome temptation of the flesh, reject all excuses. Literally rehearse God's blessings. Write them down, say them out loud, sing them. Reflect on the cost of giving in to temptation. Have that moment where you stop and just imagine, what does it look like if I follow that path of saying yes to my flesh? Remove yourself from the source. And when you can't remove yourself, you just run away. And maybe some of you this morning, maybe you're coming in here and you feel really beaten down by temptation, by the lusts of your own flesh, your own passions. I want to remind you, every single person who's ever lived has experienced temptation. You get that? You are not alone. Every single person ever who's ever lived has experienced temptation. Every single person who's ever lived has given into temptation, except one. So again, you're not alone in experiencing temptation. You're not alone in having given into temptation. You're not alone in needing forgiveness for having given in to temptation. That's the gospel. That's why Jesus died, to remove that debt of sin, but then also, having freely given you eternal life, he puts his Spirit within you so that you can say no to temptation and say yes to holiness in Jesus. So you're not alone. You're not alone in being tempted. You're not alone in having given into temptation from time to time. You're not alone in having the Spirit of God dwell in you so that you can say yes. And so this morning you may just need to have a moment where you accept God's grace again and say thank you. Maybe it's the first time. God, thank you for sending Jesus to die for my sins. I believe. When you do that, your debt of sin is removed. You have life that lasts forever. It's just a free gift. You just have to say yes. But then also you have to learn to walk in obedience, to learn to walk in dependence. And maybe right now you need to, again, in a fresh way, say, God, thank you for giving me Jesus and giving me his power and letting me start new.